such a beautiful baby. He's glowing. My son, my miracle.
We call the ancestors.
The spirits rise.
Please.
I am not afraid of you. Leave my family alone.
In the restless oil-soaked city of Wari, Delta State, where the air always smelled of fuel, rain, and whispered secrets, there lived a young woman named Tombra Okoru, a woman whose beauty was not gentle but commanding. The kind elders warned young men about in low voices, saying, "That one. She can scatter destiny if you are not careful," because Tombra was beautiful in the way nature never apologizes for, dark-skinned like rich earth after rain, smooth like polished ebony, with eyes that carried laughter and storms at the same time, and when she smiled, even grown men forgot the reason they were angry. Yet despite her looks, Tombra lived a quiet, disciplined life in a small flat on Joppa Road with her younger sister Bidamai, waking early every morning to walk to the salon where she worked as a hairdresser, a place where gossip flowed faster than water from a broken pipe and secrets fell from women's mouths like loose coins, stories of cheating husbands, wicked mothers-in-law, secret pregnancies, and desperate prayers, all shared while hair was braided tight and tears were swallowed. But Tombra never joined in, never added her own pain to the pile, keeping her heart locked away like money buried under the bed, because she had learned early that silence can be armor. And life continued like this until one Friday evening 6 years before Destiny decided to remember her name, when Tombra attended a friend's wedding dressed in simple elegance, unaware that her life was about to be rearranged by a single meeting, because that was the night she met Chuka Adisa, a young businessman from Ibadan who walked with the confidence of a man who believed the world was already negotiating with him, tall, dark, well-built, with a smile that arrived before he spoke. And when his eyes met Tombra's across the crowded hall filled with loud music, clashing colors, and sweating dancers, it felt as if the ancestors themselves leaned forward to watch, because some connections are older than the people involved, and Chuka crossed the room ignoring every other woman as if they were decorations, stopping in front of Tombra with a boldness that made her laugh before she could stop herself, introducing himself not as a stranger but as a man already planning marriage, a statement so outrageous it dissolved her defenses, and that laughter became conversation became hours of talking and shared jokes, and before the night ended, something invisible but unbreakable had already tied them together, and from that moment Chuka and Tombra became inseparable, like Gary and Sugar, like rain and red earth, with Chuka driving from Ibadan to Wari every weekend without complaint, bringing small gifts, big dreams, and laughter that made Tombra forget she had ever learned how to be guarded, and they spoke openly about marriage, children, and a future that felt solid and deserved, until fate, jealous of happiness, decided to collect payment, because on a dark, rain-soaked Sunday night, as Chuka drove back to Ibadan on a lonely highway between Wari and Benin, a tired trailer driver drifted across lanes, metal screamed against metal, glass shattered like broken promises, and in a single violent moment, Chuka Adisa's life ended, snatched away without warning or mercy, leaving Tombra with news that collapsed her world like a building with no foundation, because grief does not knock politely, it kicks down the door, and for weeks she cried until her eyes burned and her voice disappeared, refusing food, refusing comfort, convinced that life without Chuka was a punishment too heavy to survive. And though time eventually moved forward as it always does, carrying days into months and months into years, Tombra never truly healed. She only learned how to function with a wound that refused to close, throwing herself into work, saving money, smiling when required, but carrying Chuka's memory like a quiet fire in her chest, unaware that love like theirs does not accept endings easily, and that death, no matter how final it seems, sometimes makes mistakes it will later be forced to correct. 6 years after grief had carved permanent lines into Tombra Okoru's heart, on a Thursday night soaked in rain and restless thunder, the world she had carefully stitched back together began to unravel again, because storms have a way of waking things that should remain asleep. And as Tombra lay alone in her small flat on Joppa Road scrolling through her phone, the rain beating the zinc roof like angry drummers competing for dominance, thunder cracking so loudly it felt as if the sky itself was splitting open, she heard a knock at her door, sharp, deliberate, and completely wrong for that hour, causing her body to stiffen because in Wari nobody knocks past 10 with good news, and when the knock came again, louder, heavier, Tombra's heart began to race like a generator struggling to start, her mind running through thieves, ritualists, kidnappers, and all the stories women tell themselves to stay alive, and she called out demanding to know who was there, her voice shaking despite her attempt at authority, but only Rain answered her, until the knocking returned a third time, insistent now, carrying a strange familiarity that unsettled her more than fear itself, and when she finally demanded the stranger identify himself or face the police, a voice answered, soft, familiar, and impossible, a voice that spoke her name the way only one person ever had, gently, like it was something precious, saying it was cold and asking her to open the door, and in that moment Tombra's body betrayed her completely, her wrapper loosening, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor, because no matter how many years pass, grief never forgets its language, and she stammered that the man speaking was dead, buried, mourned, accusing the voice of being a demon, a madman, or a wicked spirit looking for a victim, but the voice replied calmly, patiently, insisting it was Chuka, insisting it was real, insisting it only wanted to talk, and though every warning bell in Tombra's spirit rang like cathedral bells on a Sunday morning, something older than logic moved her feet toward the door, because love leaves fingerprints on the soul that no amount of prayer can erase, and when she finally unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see outside, the world tilted on its axis, because standing there in the rain was Chuka Adisa exactly as she remembered him, same height, same face, same dimple on his left cheek, same small gap between his teeth she used to tease him about, even wearing the same blue shirt from the night he kissed her goodbye for the last time, and Tombra screamed, jumping back as if fire had touched her skin, rebuking him with every holy name she knew, calling on blood and fire and deliverance, convinced that this was madness wearing a familiar face, yet Chuka did not advance, did not threaten, only stood there with eyes heavy with sadness, explaining gently that he meant no harm, that he only needed to see her, that he could not leave without doing so, and when Tombra demanded answers, reminding him she had buried him with her own eyes, watched his coffin lowered into the ground, felt earth thrown onto finality, Chuka confessed the impossible truth, that he had indeed died that night on the highway, but love had refused to release him, trapping him between worlds, watching her grieve, watching her survive, protecting her in ways she could never see, and though the explanation sounded like madness dressed in poetry, he knew things only Chuka could know, secrets of her body, her fears, her childhood memories, and with each revelation Tombra's resistance weakened, until against every instinct screaming at her to run, she stepped aside and allowed him into her flat, failing to notice that despite the rain dripping from his clothes, the floor beneath his feet remained dry, and as he sat on her sofa exactly as he used to, the last 6 years collapsed into nothingness, leaving Tombra standing between terror and longing, realizing that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, especially when the dead refuse to stay gone. Once Chuka crossed the threshold of Tombra's flat that stormy night, nothing in her life ever returned to normal, because reality itself had bent in a way that could not be straightened again, and though fear sat in her chest like a trapped bird, curiosity and buried love refused to let it dominate. So they talked, awkwardly at first, with long silences broken only by the drumming rain and the ticking wall clock, until words began to flow, Chuka explaining how death had taken his body but not his devotion, how he had awakened after the accident confused and weightless, watching strangers cover his remains while he screamed without sound, learning slowly that he was no longer bound by flesh, yet unable to leave because Tombra's grief had tied him to the earth like an anchor. And Tombra listened with disbelief and tears, torn between wanting to chase him out with holy water and wanting to hold him so tightly that death itself would feel jealous, and as nights passed into weeks, Chuka began visiting her again, never every day because maintaining form exhausted him, but often enough that Tombra started adjusting her life around the impossible, locking her door carefully, keeping curtains drawn, lying to her sister about late nights, and slowly learning the strange rules of loving a man without a heartbeat, discovering that his touch was cool like a wall in Harmattan, that he cast no reflection in mirrors, and that exhaustion turned him faint and translucent like smoke in moonlight. Yet despite all these unnatural signs, his laughter was the same, his teasing familiar, his concern genuine, and Tombra found herself looking forward to his visits more than she was willing to admit, because loneliness is persuasive and grief leaves behind a hunger no normal companionship can satisfy, and as they shared memories, jokes, and regrets, the space between them shrank until one night conversation turned quiet and heavy, their eyes lingering too long, and though Tombra whispered that it was wrong, that pastors would scream, that ancestors might frown, that heaven itself might protest, Chuka reminded her of the promises they had made when both were alive, of the life stolen from them by fate's cruelty, and in that fragile moment where longing overpowered fear, Tombra allowed herself to forget rules written for ordinary love, because this love had already survived burial, and when they finally kissed, it was gentle, hesitant, and cold, yet real enough to make Tombra's breath hitch, and though reason told her to run, her heart recognized what it had lost and reclaimed it without permission, and from that night onward their meetings grew more intimate, more dangerous, crossing boundaries Tombra had sworn never to approach, yet each time guilt rose, Chuka's presence softened it, promising that love itself could not be sinful, that what the heart recognizes cannot be denied, and months passed in this fragile, secret rhythm until Tombra's body began to speak in ways she could not silence, first with exhaustion that clung to her bones, then nausea that greeted her every morning like an unwanted visitor, followed by tenderness and a missing cycle that sent fear crawling up her spine, and when she finally bought a pregnancy test and locked herself in the bathroom, hands shaking as if holding an explosive, time stretched cruelly during those few waiting minutes, and when 2 pink lines appeared, bold and undeniable, Tombra screamed, her voice tearing through the walls, because science had been insulted, biology mocked, and reason humiliated, as ghosts do not create life, yet life had clearly arrived, and when she confronted Chuka, shouting questions with no answers, anger replacing fear, accusing love of betrayal, Chuka stood stunned, realizing that even in death he had underestimated the power of connection, because something deeper than flesh had moved between them, something capable of crossing the boundary between worlds, and as Tombra paced her room imagining gossip, disgrace, and judgment sharper than knives, she understood that her life had crossed into territory no proverb could easily explain, because carrying a child was heavy enough, but carrying one whose father was technically dead was a burden no woman should face alone. And yet despite terror and anger, as Tombra placed her trembling hand on her stomach, something inside her shifted, because life does not wait for permission, and in that moment she knew that whatever madness had entered her story, she would face it standing, because love without breath had already rewritten her destiny, and there was no turning back. Pregnancy has a way of dragging truth into the open no matter how hard one tries to hide it, and as weeks rolled into months, Tombra's body began to tell a story she was not ready to explain to the world, her belly swelling slowly like dough rising in secret, her strength fading, her emotions swinging like a door without a hinge, and fear followed her everywhere like a persistent shadow, because in a place like Wari, a woman's pregnancy without a visible man is already a crime in the court of public opinion, talk less of a pregnancy whose father existed only after midnight, and though Chuka tried to reassure her, promising protection and presence, Tombra knew ghosts could not stand in daylight to defend a woman from gossip sharper than broken bottles, so she sought counsel from Mama Felicia, an elderly woman in their compound whose eyes had seen too much of life to be easily shocked, and when Tombra poured out the impossible truth in a trembling voice, expecting disbelief or condemnation, Mama Felicia only nodded slowly, listening as though she had heard stranger stories whispered by the wind, reminding Tombra that love can bind spirits to earth and that not every unseen thing comes with evil intentions, but warning her gently that caution was still necessary, because some spirits were familiar faces like borrowed clothes, and though Tombra tested Chuka with prayer and holy oil and found only honesty and patience, doubt never fully left her, lingering quietly like a mosquito waiting for night. And as the pregnancy advanced, something else changed too, because Chuka's presence grew stronger, his form more solid, his touch warmer, as though the unborn child was pulling him closer to the living world with invisible strings, anchoring him to flesh and breath. And when the day of labor arrived, it arrived without mercy, announcing itself to the compound with screams that split the dawn, causing neighbors to whisper and cross themselves as Tombra was rushed to the hospital, her pain raw and consuming, her curses aimed at every man living or dead, and in the delivery room, as doctors and nurses worked with practiced urgency, Chuka stood by her side unseen, whispering encouragement, his presence lending strength where fear threatened to take over. And after hours that felt like years, the child finally entered the world with a cry loud enough to silence every doubt, a baby boy perfect in form yet impossible in origin, and as the doctor lifted him up, a strange glow pulsed briefly from his skin, soft and otherworldly like moonlight caught in human flesh, causing the room to fall into stunned silence, because this was not metaphor, not imagination, but something real that faded quickly, leaving behind unanswered questions, and Tombra stared at her son through tears of exhaustion and wonder, knowing in her bones that whatever this child was, he was hers, and she named him a Momi, gift from God, because only the divine could explain such defiance. of nature, and in the days that followed, the strangeness did not end, because while others saw nothing, Amomi smiled and cooed at empty spaces where Chuka stood, his tiny eyes following a presence no one else could perceive, and with each passing day Chuka grew stronger, able to touch, to eat, to cast a faint shadow, as though fatherhood itself was pulling him back from the edge of death. Yet with this miracle came fear, because miracles rarely come without a price, and Tombra knew she could not walk this path blindly, so guided by Mama Felicia, they traveled to Benin City to seek Baba Oazwa, a powerful spiritualist known for understanding things that lived between worlds, and when Baba Oazwa looked upon Chuka and the glowing-eyed child, he spoke words that chilled the room, explaining that Amomi had created a bridge between life and death, a bridge fueled by love strong enough to refuse separation, and while this bridge allowed Chuka to remain, it was unstable, temporary, and dangerous, for to become fully alive again, Chuka would have to return to the moment of his death and complete what he had failed to finish, facing pain beyond memory with no guarantee of survival, and as the weight of that revelation settled over them, Tombra held her child tighter, realizing that her love story had become something far larger than romance, because now it involved sacrifice, courage, and a child who existed as proof that even death could be challenged, but never without consequence. The revelation Baba Oazwa delivered hung in the air like thick smoke that refused to clear, because hope had just been given a shape but also a cost, and Tombra felt her chest tighten as she stared at Chuka, realizing that the miracle she had prayed for came wrapped in danger sharp enough to cut faith itself. For Baba Oazwa spoke calmly, the way men who understand death often do, explaining that Chuka existed in an unfinished state, neither fully dead nor truly alive, suspended like a trapped breath, because love had chained him to the world of the living, and Amomi's birth had strengthened that chain into a bridge, yet bridges can collapse if not crossed properly, and to become fully human again, Chuka would have to return spiritually to the exact moment of his accident, relive the rain, the darkness, the blinding headlights, the crushing impact, and this time choose life with every fragment of will he possessed, fighting where he had once surrendered to shock and confusion. Knowing that failure would not return him to his ghostly half-existence but would erase him completely, and Tombra's knees nearly gave way at the thought, because she had survived losing him once only by learning how to breathe through pain, and now she was being asked to risk losing him again with her eyes open. Yet Chuka listened in silence, his gaze shifting between Tombra and their sleeping child, understanding immediately what was at stake, because love does not need long explanations to recognize sacrifice, and when Baba Oazwa asked whether he was willing to pay the price, Chuka answered without hesitation, saying that a life spent watching from shadows was not life at all, that a father must be able to stand in the sun, hold his child in public, and grow old beside the woman he loved, even if the attempt killed him, and Tombra protested, tears spilling freely, arguing that half of him was better than none of him, that she could endure whispers, secrecy, and strange nights if it meant keeping him, but Chuka shook his head gently, reminding her that love should not sentence itself to hiding forever, that Amomi deserved a father who breathed and bled and could walk him to school, and after long painful silence, Tombra agreed, because motherhood had already taught her that courage is often choosing fear anyway, and the ritual was set for 3 nights later, because such things must always be done at midnight when the veil between worlds grows thin, and when the night arrived. Baba Oazwa prepared his inner sanctuary with white chalk symbols drawn carefully on the floor, candles arranged in ancient patterns, and herbs burning with a bitter scent that made the air feel heavy, while Mama Felicia held Amomi tightly, whispering prayers older than memory, and Chuka lay on a woven mat at the center of the symbols as Baba Oazwa instructed him one last time, warning that when the pain came, he must not give in, must not let the memory carry him, must fight to turn the wheel, must choose survival where he once accepted fate, and as the chanting began, the temperature dropped sharply, candles flickered violently despite the still air, and Chuka's body stiffened, his breath growing erratic as his spirit was dragged backward through time, and suddenly the room filled with invisible sounds, screeching tires, shattering glass, the roar of rain on metal, and Chuka screamed, thrashing on the mat as though wrestling an unseen enemy, his body flickering between solid flesh and translucent spirit, blood seeping from his nose as the memory tore through him, and Tombra screamed his name, straining against Baba Oazwa's command not to touch him, because one touch could sever the process and kill him completely. And so she watched helplessly as the man she loved died again before her eyes, fighting a battle no one else could see, until suddenly everything went still, the chanting stopped, the air grew quiet, and Chuka lay motionless, breath gone, eyes lifeless, and Tombra broke free, collapsing beside him, shaking his body, begging him not to abandon her again, her tears soaking his chest, until at last, with a violent gasp like a man breaking the surface after drowning, Chuka inhaled deeply, eyes flying open in confusion and terror, his chest rising and falling with unmistakable human breath, and Baba Oaswa pressed 2 fingers to his neck and smiled slowly, announcing that a strong pulse beat beneath his skin, real and living, and Tombra felt warmth radiating from Chuka's body, undeniable, human, miraculous, as he whispered in disbelief that he was alive, truly alive, and in that moment, as they clung to each other on the cold floor, Tombra understood that love had not only crossed death, it had dragged life back with it, bleeding, shaking, but victorious. Though Chuka had returned to life with breath in his lungs and warmth in his skin, death did not release him without leaving fingerprints behind, and as days passed after the ritual, Tombra began to notice the subtle wrongness clinging to their miracle like smoke after fire, because while Chuka laughed, ate, slept, and held their son with trembling joy, certain things refused to align fully with the living world, such as the way dogs whimpered and backed away when he walked past, or how electric bulbs flickered faintly when he entered a room, or how mirrors occasionally delayed his reflection by a heartbeat, as though reality itself needed a moment to confirm his presence, and Baba Oaswa had warned them that returning from death rarely comes clean, that the world keeps accounts carefully, and Chuka's return had created a debt that would eventually demand attention, yet for a while happiness drowned out caution, because Tombra finally experienced ordinary joys she once thought forever stolen, waking beside a breathing man, arguing over food, laughing at small foolish things, and watching Chuka carry a momi proudly in daylight without fear or secrecy, and the neighbors whispered but no longer questioned openly, because Chuka's pulse was real, his blood red, his smile human, and life slowly settled into something resembling normal, until the dreams began, dreams that were not dreams at all, but memories invading Chuka's sleep, dragging him back to twisted metal and rain soaked asphalt, causing him to wake screaming, drenched in sweat, clutching at his chest as though searching for a wound no longer there, and each time Tombra held him, whispering reassurance, yet fear tightened its grip around her heart, because she knew unfinished journeys always try to complete themselves. And then one evening as the sun bled orange into the sky, Mama Felicia arrived unannounced, her face grave, her steps hesitant, explaining that she had been visited by her own grandmother. In a dream, a woman dead for over 40 years, who spoke of imbalance and warned that something meant to stay buried was walking too freely among the living, and before Tombra could respond, the air in the room thickened, growing cold and heavy, and a presence settled there uninvited, unseen yet undeniable, causing a momi to begin crying sharply as though sensing danger, and Chuka froze mid-step, his eyes darkening as recognition passed through him, because he felt it too, the pull of the other side calling for correction, and that night the shadow finally revealed itself, manifesting at the foot of their bed as a darker version of Chuka, identical yet hollow-eyed, its voice echoing like sound traveling through water, accusing Chuka of theft, reminding him that life reclaimed must be paid for, because when he had died the first time, his name had already been written among the departed, and names written there are not easily erased, and Tombra screamed prayers into the darkness, clutching a momi tightly, while Chuka stood trembling yet defiant, demanding to know the price, and the shadow answered with cruel simplicity, declaring that balance required exchange, that either Chuka would return to death willingly, restoring order, or someone bound to him by blood would be taken instead. And the room fell into horrified silence, because threats mean little until they touch a child, and Chuka fell to his knees, begging, pleading, offering himself, his strength, his years. Anything but his son, and the shadow lingered long enough to let terror sink deep before fading, promising return at the appointed time, and when it vanished, Chuka collapsed, understanding fully now that resurrection had not been a gift but a loan, and as dawn approached, they returned to Baba Oaswa, who listened without interruption before confirming their fear, explaining that Chuka's shadow was not a demon but a spiritual echo, the part of him that had completed death and remained behind to guard the boundary, now enraged by imbalance, and only one solution remained, a binding choice that would permanently sever Chuka from the dead realm, but at a terrible cost, because to do so he would have to surrender all spiritual protection, becoming fully human, fragile, mortal, and vulnerable to fate without interference from ancestors, spirits, or divine exceptions, meaning illness, accidents, and death would come to him like they come to every ordinary man, without delay or rescue, and though Tombra protested, realizing this meant losing the supernatural shield that had once saved him, Chuka accepted without hesitation, because a short human life lived fully was worth more than eternity half alive and hunted, and so the final ritual was prepared, one not to restore life but to sever death completely, and as Baba Oaswa marked Chuka's forehead with ashen blood mixed together, binding flesh to flesh alone, the shadow appeared one last time, screaming in rage as it was pulled backward into darkness, tearing away like a wound finally closing, and when silence returned, Chuka collapsed again, weaker than before but undeniably human, and as Tombra held him while Amomi slept peacefully for the first time in days, she understood that love does not conquer death without scars, because some victories are paid for not with blood alone, but with the surrender of magic itself. After the severing ritual, life did not explode into drama or celebration the way stories often promise, because the hardest magic of all is learning how to live normally after touching the impossible, and Chuka discovered this truth slowly, painfully, in the quiet days that followed. As his body adjusted to being fully human again, fragile in ways it had not been for years, catching fevers that lingered too long, bruising easily, tiring faster than he remembered, and though Baba Oazwa assured them this weakness was temporary, a necessary recalibration after crossing worlds, Tombra watched him constantly, fear sitting behind her eyes like a second pair of lashes, because now there were no spirits standing guard, no ancestors bending fate, only ordinary breath and beating flesh that could fail like anyone else's, and Chuka felt it too, the weight of mortality pressing down on him with unfamiliar heaviness, because when a man has died once, every cough sounds like a warning and every pain feels like a reminder, yet despite the fear, he embraced life fiercely, waking early, walking Amomi through the compound, greeting neighbors with humility instead of mystery, finding work again as a mechanic, his hands remembering oil and metal more easily than rituals and shadows. And the community slowly accepted him not because they understood his return, but because consistency dulls curiosity, and soon Chuka became just another man with a past people whispered about but no longer questioned aloud, and Tombra found comfort in routine, in cooking meals, folding clothes, arguing over money, things she once thought too boring to value, now sacred in their ordinariness, yet even as peace settled, the past did not release them completely. Because Amomi grew differently from other children, not in ways that screamed danger, but in quiet, unsettling ones, such as how he rarely cried, how his gaze lingered too long on nothing, how animals calmed in his presence instead of fleeing, and how he sometimes spoke words no child his age should know, referring to things before they happened, like rain or visitors, and while Baba Oazwa insisted this was residue, a spiritual sensitivity inherited from conception, not a curse, Tombra worried endlessly, fearing that their child might forever walk the thin line between worlds just as his father once had, and one afternoon as Amomi napped, Tombra finally voiced her deepest fear to Chuka, asking whether choosing humanity over magic had doomed their son to carry the burden alone, and Chuka listened quietly before answering with a truth shaped by death itself, saying that no child escapes inheritance, whether it is poverty, trauma, faith, or history, and that Amomi's inheritance was not darkness but awareness, the ability to sense depth where others see only surface, and that such a gift, if guided with love instead of fear, could become strength rather than sorrow, and though Tombra was not fully convinced, she held onto his words because mothers often survive by believing before understanding, and as months turned into years, life continued its steady march forward, Amomi learning to walk, then to run, then to ask difficult questions about the world and his father's scars. And though Chuka never hid the truth completely, he told it gently, explaining that he had once been lost and had fought hard to return, teaching his son that life is not something to take lightly because it can be taken away without asking permission, and Amomi listened with a seriousness beyond his age, absorbing lessons not meant for children, and on the anniversary of Chuka's death and return, Tombra stood outside at night watching her husband and son sleep peacefully, realizing that love had not rewarded them with perfection, but with something more honest, a chance to build meaning from survival rather than miracles, and when Mama Felicia passed away quietly in her sleep not long after, Tombra mourned her deeply, understanding that some guardians do not wear wings but wrappers and wisdom, and at the burial, as elders spoke of balance and seasons, Tombra finally understood what the story of her life had been trying to teach her all along, that death is not always the end. But neither is survival the same as victory, because true triumph lies in choosing life every day even when it offers no guarantees. And as Chuka squeezed her hand, warm and real, she smiled softly, because the man who once loved her without breath now loved her with all the limitations and risks of being human, and that, she realized, was the greatest miracle of all. Years later, when the sharp edges of fear had dulled into memory and the story of Chuka's return had softened into something almost believable, Tombra often found herself thinking not about the night death broke its rules, but about what followed after the rules were restored. because miracles are loud when they arrive but quiet when they leave, and it is in that silence that people truly reveal who they have become, and Chuka had become a man who woke before dawn to pray not for protection but for gratitude, whose hands bore scars from engines and labor rather than rituals and symbols, whose laughter came easily yet carried an undertone of reverence for time, and Tom Braw watched him with a tenderness shaped by knowing exactly how easily he could have been absent. Because love that has survived burial does not need constant fireworks to feel real, and Amomi grew into a thoughtful boy, observant and gentle, asking questions that startled teachers and silenced elders, questions about why people fear death yet waste life, about whether spirits feel lonely, about whether love can change fate again, and though Tombra worried these questions marked him as different, she learned slowly that difference is not always a wound, sometimes it is a calling waiting for language. And on the evening of Amomi's 10th birthday, the air heavy with the smell of rain and roasted corn, the family gathered quietly in their compound, no grand party, just food, laughter, and shared presence, and as night settled, Tom Braw noticed something unusual, a stillness that felt familiar, not threatening but watchful, like the pause before a remembered song, and she stiffened instinctively, fear rising from old places, but Chuka felt it too and squeezed her hand gently, signaling calm rather than alarm, because some presences come not to collect debts but to close accounts, and at the edge of the compound, barely visible in the dim light, stood Baba Oaswa, older now, slower, yet smiling with a peace that suggested his work here was done, and he spoke briefly, telling them that balance had been restored fully, that the dead no longer whispered Chuka's name, that the bridge Amomi was born upon had dissolved naturally as the boy anchored himself firmly in the living world, and that what remained was choice. Nothing mystical, nothing borrowed, just the responsibility of being human, and as he turned to leave, Baba Oaswa warned Amomi gently that awareness must always walk hand in hand with humility, because seeing more than others does not mean standing above them, and Amomi nodded solemnly, understanding far more than his age suggested, and when the old man disappeared into the night, Tombra felt a weight lift from her chest she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there, and later that night as rain finally fell softly, not violently, Tombra lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of her home, her husband breathing beside her, her child murmuring in sleep, and she realized that the story she had lived would never truly end, because stories like hers do not conclude with answers but with continuations, and though neighbors still whispered and strangers still sensed something unusual about their family, Tombra no longer cared, because survival had taught her that normalcy is not the absence of strangeness but the decision to keep living despite it, and years later, when Chuka's hair grayed and Tombra's steps slowed, they would sit together telling Amomi's children a carefully softened version of the truth, not to frighten them but to teach them respect for life's fragility, and on the day Chuka would eventually die again, this time truly, naturally, without shadows or bargains, Tombra would mourn him not with terror but with gratitude, because she had been given more time than fate initially allowed, and as Amomi stood beside her strong and grounded, she would finally understand the deepest truth of all, that love does not defeat death by refusing it, but by living fully in the time it is granted, and that what survives after miracles end is not magic, but memory, meaning, and the quiet courage to choose life again and again, even when no spirits are watching.